Sugar, a simple crystal that melts on the tongue and makes almost everything taste better. To us today, sugar feels ordinary, even cheap. We spoon it into coffee without a second thought. We find it in every packaged product on the supermarket shelf, and we struggle against its temptations every time we see a dessert. But sugar's story is anything but ordinary. This sweet substance has shaped empires, driven economies, enslaved millions, and transformed global health. For thousands of years, sugar was rare and precious, a treasure carried along distant trade routes, a substance reserved for temples, rulers, and the wealthy elite. Later, it would become the fuel of industry, the foundation of colonial power, and one of the first truly global commodities. The history of sugar is not only the story of sweetness, but also of conquest, slavery, revolution, and addiction. It is a story that begins in the fields of ancient India, travels through the laboratories of Arab alchemists, and reaches the dining halls of medieval kings. It is a story written in sweat and blood, crystallized into something deceptively innocent and white. Tonight, we will follow the long journey of sugar. From its birth as a reed in tropical soils to its place on every table in the modern world. We will see how it seduced palates, how it became a symbol of power, and how it left a bitter aftertaste that still lingers today. Long before sugar became a global obsession, before it fueled wars and built empires, it was simply a tall grass growing in the warm, fertile lands of South and Southeast Asia. This grass was sugarcane, a plant with thick stalks filled with a juice so sweet that those who first chewed it must have thought they had discovered a miracle of nature. The earliest references to sugarcane come from ancient India, more than 2,500 years ago. Sanskrit texts describe a substance called sharkara, the origin of our modern word sugar. The word itself means grit or pebble, a description of the crystalline form that sugar would later take when boiled and dried. In India, people first discovered that by crushing the cane and evaporating the juice, they could produce tiny crystals of sweetness that could be stored, traded, and transported. This process was revolutionary. Most sweeteners available to ancient civilizations came from honey, dates, or fruit. Honey was valuable, but it was difficult to store in large quantities and could spoil. Fruit was seasonal and perishable. Sugarcane offered something different, a reliable, concentrated sweetness that could last for months, even years, without spoiling. It was portable, measurable, and incredibly powerful in small amounts. By the 5th century BCE, sugar was already more than a food. It was used in Ayurvedic medicine, the ancient Indian system of healing. Physicians prescribed sugar for digestive problems, fevers, and wounds. Combined with herbs, it became part of syrups and tonics. Its ability to preserve made it valuable for preparing medicines that could last longer. For ancient Indians, sugar was not simply a luxury. It was both nourishment and remedy. From India, sugar began to spread eastward and westward. In China, knowledge of sugarcane arrived around the 4th century CE. The Chinese quickly adapted the methods of boiling cane juice into crystals. and they began cultivating sugar in the southern provinces. By the Tang dynasty, sugar had become a favorite of the imperial court. Poets compared its sweetness to beauty, and cooks used it to create elaborate pastries and syrups. Meanwhile, in Persia, sugar arrived through contacts with India. The Achaemenid Empire, and later the Sasanian Empire, learned the art of extracting crystals from cane juice. When Alexander the Great invaded India in the 4th century BCE, his soldiers encountered a reed that gives honey without bees. This was their first taste of sugarcane. Although they did not yet understand the process of crystallization, the idea of such a plant left a strong impression on the Greeks and Romans. The Romans themselves remained largely dependent on honey for sweetness, but they recorded knowledge of sugar through their contact with Persia. To them, sugar was still a curiosity, rare, exotic, and almost medicinal in its application. Pliny the Elder, the Roman author and naturalist, described sugar as a kind of honey found in canes, white as gum, which crunches between the teeth. For centuries, sugar would remain more a medicine than a food in the Greco-Roman world. The real transformation came with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Arab scholars, merchants, and farmers became the great carriers of sugar. They improved techniques of refining, turning cane juice into fine crystals through filtration and repeated boiling. They also spread sugarcane cultivation across the lands they conquered, from Persia to North Africa, and eventually to Spain. By the 10th century, sugarcane fields were thriving in the Mediterranean world, and sugar was increasingly known not as medicine, but as food. Yet, in these early centuries, sugar remained rare. It was expensive, labor-intensive to produce, and its cultivation demanded warm climates, abundant water, and careful management. For this reason, sugar was mostly confined to elites. It sweetened the tables of kings and caliphs, appeared in ceremonial banquets, and was given as a gift more precious than gold. In the medieval imagination, sugar was almost magical, a substance that transformed food into luxury. In temples and religious rituals, sugar was offered to the gods. In households, it was a mark of wealth. In medicine, it continued to hold its dual role as both sweetener and cure. The earliest story of sugar, therefore, is not only about agriculture, but also about symbolism. Sugar was born as a plant, but it grew into a cultural force. It is worth remembering that in these centuries, sweetness itself was rare. Most people lived their lives tasting little more than the natural sugars in fruits or honey when available. To encounter a grain of sugar on the tongue was to taste something extraordinary, almost otherworldly. In India, it was associated with fertility and prosperity. In China, with refinement and beauty. In Persia, with medicine and luxury. Sugar was becoming more than just food. It was beginning its journey as history itself. When we left the story of sugar, it had already traveled from India to China and Persia, leaving its sweet mark on medicine, ritual, and elite dining. But the true turning point in sugar's history came with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. It was the Arab world that took sugar from being a rare curiosity to becoming a refined product, a trade commodity, and eventually a global obsession. The Arabs did not invent sugarcane cultivation, but they perfected the art of refining it. They brought together the agricultural knowledge of India, the scientific curiosity of Persia, and their own relentless drive for commerce. Under the expanding Islamic Caliphate, sugar found the perfect conditions to spread, politically, agriculturally, and culturally. The centuries following the rise of Islam were a period of extraordinary growth in science, medicine, and trade. Scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba preserved and expanded the knowledge of the ancient world. Among the many sciences they advanced, chemistry and medicine held a special place. Sugar became an object of fascination for both. Arab chemists studied the crystallization process with great care. They developed methods of clarifying cane juice by filtering it through ashes and clays, boiling it in large cauldrons, and drying it in conical molds. This produced sugar that was purer, whiter, and easier to transport. These sugar cones became a standard form of trade, solid blocks that merchants could chip away from, easy to weigh and sell. Doctors and physicians in the Islamic world eagerly embraced sugar. They mixed it with herbs to create syrups, pills, and electuaries, sticky medicinal pastes that could be stored for long periods. The sweetness of sugar helped mask the bitterness of drugs, making them more palatable for patients. Medical texts written in Arabic frequently mention sugar as an essential ingredient in remedies for coughs, stomach ailments, fevers, and wounds. One famous physician, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, described sugar in his canon of medicine in the 11th century as not only a sweetener, but also a healing substance with cooling properties. His writings, translated into Latin, would later influence European medicine for centuries. Through such works, sugar's dual identity as both food and medicine was firmly established. Under the early caliphs, Arab armies and settlers spread across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. With them came sugarcane. They planted it in the fertile valleys of Syria, in the Nile Delta of Egypt, along the coast of North Africa, and in the warm lands of Andalusia. Wherever the climate was suitable, sugar followed. These plantations required advanced irrigation. The Arabs were masters of water management. They built canals, aqueducts, and water wheels to channel rivers and lift water into fields. Sugarcane was a thirsty crop, demanding constant moisture, and Arab agricultural science provided the means to sustain it. The sight of green cane fields waving under the Mediterranean sun became increasingly common from the 8th century onward. In these new lands, sugar production was labor-intensive. It required cutting the cane, crushing it quickly before it spoiled, boiling the juice in great cauldrons, filtering and drying. The process demanded not only workers, but also infrastructure. Mills powered by animals or water wheels became a regular feature of sugar-producing regions. Entire communities were organized around this cycle of planting, harvesting, and refining. For the wealthy elite of the Islamic world, sugar quickly became a symbol of refinement and power. Banquets in Baghdad featured dishes glazed with sugar syrups, fruits preserved in sugar, and pastries layered with sweetness. Recipes from Arabic cookbooks of the 10th and 11th centuries describe elaborate confections, candied nuts, sugared rose petals, and even sculptures made of hardened sugar, shaped into animals or architectural forms. Sugar was also deeply embedded in rituals. During festivals such as Ramadan and Eid, sugar-based sweets became traditional offerings. In weddings, sugar symbolized prosperity and fertility. Even in funerals, it appeared as part of ritual meals. Its role was no longer limited to medicine. Sugar was now woven into the fabric of social and religious life. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of sugar's role in Arab culture was its connection to hospitality. In many Islamic traditions, offering something sweet to a guest was a mark of generosity. To present sugar was to present wealth and refinement. This custom would later echo in European courts, where sugar became the centerpiece of extravagant feasts. As sugar production grew, so did trade. Merchants carried sugar across the Mediterranean in ships and overland by caravan. In the great markets of Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba, sugar was sold alongside spices, silk, and precious metals. It became one of the prized luxury goods of the Islamic world. Because sugar was expensive to produce, its price remained high. Only the wealthy could afford to buy it regularly, which reinforced its image as a luxury. But this exclusivity also made it highly desirable. By the 10th century, sugar had become a key part of the luxury trade that connected the Islamic world with Byzantium and Latin Europe. Venetian merchants, always alert to opportunities, began importing sugar from Arab lands. For Europeans, sugar was still exotic and rare, but it was beginning to appear more frequently in apothecaries and at the tables of nobles. In Latin medical texts translated from Arabic, sugar was recommended for a wide range of treatments. Its role as a medicinal substance would remain dominant in Europe for centuries. It is difficult to overstate the importance of Arab contributions to sugar. Without their advances in refining, cultivation, and trade, sugar might have remained a local curiosity. Instead, it became a product that could move across continents. When Europeans launched the Crusades in the 11th and 12th centuries, they encountered sugar in the Levant. Crusaders tasted it in Syria and Palestine, and they brought back tales of its sweetness. Some even returned with small quantities, which were sold in Europe as precious medicine. By this time, sugar was being called zucchero in Italian, sucre in French, and zucker in German, all derived from the original Sanskrit sharkara through Arabic intermediaries. This linguistic journey mirrors the material journey of sugar itself. Through Arab hands, sugar gained not only new names, but also new status. It was no longer just an Indian or Persian curiosity. It had become an international product, circulating through the arteries of trade that connected East and West. By the late Middle Ages, the Arab world had established sugar as a staple of luxury culture. They had refined its production, expanded its cultivation, embedded it in medicine and ritual, and spread it across 3 continents. They had created a model of sugar as a commodity, valuable, desirable, and capable of transforming economies. This legacy would have profound consequences. When European powers began their age of exploration, they were already familiar with sugar, already addicted to its sweetness, and already eager to control its supply. The plantations of Syria and Andalusia would become the prototypes for the vast sugar colonies of the Caribbean and Brazil. The watermills of Egypt would inspire the mills of the New World. And the trade networks of the Arab merchants would foreshadow the global trade empires of Europe. Sugar's journey through the Arab world was not just a chapter in history. It was the turning point that set the stage for the centuries to come. Without the Arab connection, sugar might never have become the world-changing force it later proved to be. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, sugar was poised to leap across the seas, to fuel new conquests, and to leave a far darker mark on humanity. The sweet gift of the Arabs would become, in time, the bitter poison of empire. By the end of the first millennium, sugar had already traveled a long road. Born in India, refined in the Arab world, and traded across the Mediterranean. But its entry into Europe marked a new phase, one that would transform sugar from a rare medicinal substance into the obsession of kings, merchants, and eventually ordinary people. The earliest significant European encounter with sugar came during the Crusades, beginning in the late 11th century. When European knights marched into the Levant, they encountered a world rich in goods that were rare back home: spices, silk, perfumes, and sugar. Chroniclers record their astonishment at this new honey that came from reeds instead of bees. Returning crusaders brought back not only tales, but also small quantities of sugar. In 1101, the chronicler William of Tyre wrote of sugar as a most precious product, very necessary for the use and health of mankind. In these early moments, Europeans treated sugar primarily as medicine. Apothecaries sold it in tiny amounts, often prescribed for fevers or digestive troubles. Its price was so high that only the wealthiest could even consider buying it. But the taste was unforgettable. For men and women accustomed to honey as their primary sweetener, sugar was smoother, cleaner, and less prone to spoilage. It had an almost magical quality, white crystals that seemed pure and perfect, dissolving instantly on the tongue. This first taste planted a desire that would only grow. Europe did not remain content with importing sugar from Arab lands. As Christian kingdoms expanded into southern Spain, Sicily, and eventually the Canary Islands, they discovered climates suitable for sugarcane. Taking over both the land and the techniques developed by Arab farmers, Europeans began cultivating cane for themselves. By the 12th century, sugarcane fields flourished in Sicily under Norman and later Spanish rulers. In the 13th century, Cyprus and Crete also became centers of sugar production, largely under the control of Italian merchants. These plantations were smaller than what would come later in the Americas, but they were intensive and labor-demanding. The Venetians, already masters of Mediterranean trade, quickly saw the opportunity. They became the great distributors of sugar in Europe, importing from Cyprus and Crete refining it in Venice and selling it across the continent. The city became one of the first true sugar hubs of Europe, a place where wealth crystallized as surely as cane juice. In medieval Europe, sugar retained its dual identity as medicine and luxury. Physicians prescribed it for ailments, often mixing it with herbs to create syrups and lozenges. It was thought to balance the humors, the four bodily fluids that medieval medicine believed governed health. Sweetness was associated with moderation and harmony, making sugar a kind of universal corrective. At the same time, nobles and royals discovered sugar's culinary power. In the courts of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, sugar was used to sweeten wines, to glaze meats, and to create elaborate confections. Records show that Henry III of England, in the 13th century, ordered sugar for his royal kitchens, even when its cost was astronomical. For perspective, in some parts of Europe, sugar could cost up to 100 times more than honey. To own sugar was to display power. It was served at feasts in sculpted forms. Towers, animals, even castles made entirely of sugar paste. These were not meant to be eaten casually. They were edible art, symbols of wealth and sophistication. Guests at such banquets would marvel at these creations, knowing that the cost of a single sugar sculpture might equal the yearly income of a farmer. Despite its growing popularity among elites, sugar remained extremely rare. The labor required for cultivation and refining kept supply low. Every step of the process, cutting cane, pressing juice, boiling in cauldrons, drying in molds, demanded workers and fuel. Forests were cut down to feed the fires of sugar refineries. The result was a product too expensive for ordinary people. By the late Middle Ages, sugar was firmly entrenched in Europe's luxury economy. Alongside silk and spices, it was a symbol of global connection. Merchants grew rich importing it. Rulers grew powerful by controlling its trade. But for the common person, it remained a distant dream, glimpsed only in rare festival dishes or in the apothecary's shop for illness. Sugar also began to inspire metaphors and language in Europe. To call someone sweet was to compare them to sugar, desirable, refined, delightful. In literature, sugar symbolized love, temptation, and extravagance. Medieval poets wrote of kisses sweeter than sugar and compared the beauty of beloveds to candied fruit. Religious authorities, however, expressed caution. Some church writers worried that sugar, like other luxuries, could encourage gluttony and sin. To indulge in too much sweetness was to endanger the soul. And yet, sugar also found its way into monastic traditions, especially in the making of preserved fruits and medicinal cordials. Monasteries became centers of sugar knowledge, experimenting with its uses even as they warned against excess. By the 14th century, Europe was developing a taste that would become an obsession. Although still confined to the wealthy, sugar consumption was rising steadily. Nobles demanded it at feasts. Physicians prescribed it more frequently. Merchants expanded trade routes to secure it. When the Black Death devastated Europe in the mid-14th century, sugar was among the goods people believed could protect health. Apothecaries sold sugary syrups as preventatives against plague. Even though such remedies were ineffective, they reflected sugar's growing role as a substance associated with healing, strength, and vitality. This belief in sugar as medicine reinforced its desirability. People were willing to pay enormous sums, not just for the pleasure of sweetness, but for the hope of protection and longevity. Thus, sugar began to occupy a psychological as well as physical space in European life. By the late 15th century, Europe's appetite for sugar was far larger than its supply. The Mediterranean plantations could not keep up with demand. Prices remained high, and merchants dreamed of new lands where sugar could be grown on a larger scale. This hunger for sugar coincided with the age of exploration. Portuguese and Spanish explorers, sailing along the coasts of Africa and across the Atlantic, were not only looking for spices and gold, but also for land to plant sugarcane. When Columbus voyaged to the Caribbean in 1493, he carried sugarcane cuttings with him. It would not be long before the New World became the center of sugar production, reshaping the globe. But before that great leap, Europe had already been transformed by sugar's arrival. From the Crusaders' first taste to the Venetian merchant's fortune, from the physician's prescription to the king's banquet, sugar had embedded itself deeply into European culture. It was no longer a curiosity from the East. It was a necessity of power, prestige, and desire. Sugar's journey into Europe illustrates a pattern that would repeat throughout history. A rare substance becomes a symbol of status, then a commodity, then a mass addiction. In medieval Europe, sugar was still in its first two phases. It was luxury and medicine, not yet the daily staple it would become. But the foundation was laid. Europe was ready to pursue sugar to the ends of the earth, and in doing so, it would unleash forces of colonization, slavery, and empire that would reshape the modern world. By the end of the 15th century, Europe's appetite for sugar had grown into something insatiable. The small plantations of Sicily, Cyprus, and Crete could no longer satisfy the demand of kings, nobles, and merchants. Sugar had become the white gold of its age, worth extraordinary sums and increasingly essential to elite culture. And so, when European powers launched their voyages of exploration, they carried with them not only dreams of spices and gold, but also the ambition to cultivate sugar on a massive scale. This ambition would give birth to one of the darkest chapters in human history, the era of colonial sugar. In 1493, on his second voyage to the New World, Christopher Columbus brought sugarcane cuttings from the Canary Islands to the Caribbean. The climate proved ideal: warm, humid, with abundant rainfall and fertile volcanic soil. Within a few decades, plantations began to spread across Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. From these first experiments grew an agricultural revolution that would reshape entire continents. The Portuguese, meanwhile, had already planted sugar in their Atlantic island colonies, Madeira, the Azores, and São Tomé. These islands became laboratories for plantation agriculture. There, Europeans learned the brutal efficiency of organizing land, labor, and machinery to maximize production. When they looked at Brazil, colonized in the early 1500s, they saw a paradise for sugar cultivation. Soon, the Brazilian coast was covered in vast fields of cane. The combination of European maritime power, American land, and African labor created what historians call the sugar complex, a system of exploitation that drove the global economy for centuries. The expansion of sugar was inseparable from the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. Sugarcane was a crop that demanded endless labor: planting, cutting, hauling, crushing, boiling. European settlers quickly realized that indigenous populations, devastated by disease and overwork, could not provide the labor force they needed. Instead, they turned to Africa. Ships sailed from Europe to the African coast, carrying manufactured goods, weapons, and textiles. There they purchased enslaved men, women, and children, who were packed into ships and transported across the Atlantic in the horrific Middle Passage. Survivors of that journey were sold in the Caribbean and Brazil to work the sugar plantations. The same ships then carried sugar, molasses, and rum back to Europe, completing what became known as the triangular trade. This system enriched merchants in London, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and Bordeaux, fueled industries in Europe, and condemned millions of Africans to bondage and death. The statistics are staggering. By the 18th century, sugar plantations were consuming the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans every year. Mortality rates were so high that plantation owners did not rely on natural reproduction, but on a constant influx of new captives. For many, sugar truly was sweet for the consumer, but bitter beyond measure for the producer. Colonial sugar plantations were massive enterprises. A single estate could cover thousands of acres, with rows of cane stretching to the horizon. At the center stood the sugar mill, a complex of buildings where cane was crushed, juice boiled, and crystals dried. These mills were powered at first by animals or water wheels, and later by windmills, and eventually steam engines. Life on the plantation was brutally hard. Enslaved workers labored from dawn to dusk under the lash of overseers. Cutting cane was back-breaking, dangerous work. Boiling the juice required working over open vats of scalding liquid. Accidents were common, and conditions were inhumane. Workers were housed in barracks, given meager rations, and subjected to constant violence. Plantation owners grew fabulously wealthy, but their wealth was built on suffering. The profits from sugar flowed back to Europe, financing palaces, wars, and new industries. Cities like Bristol, Liverpool, and Nantes grew rich as sugar ports. Amsterdam became a hub of sugar refining. Across Europe, fortunes were made, all on the backs of enslaved labor in the colonies. As production increased, sugar began to move beyond the tables of kings. By the 17th century, sugar was reaching a broader market in Europe. Prices fell, consumption rose, and sugar became the companion of two other colonial imports: tea and coffee. The English East India Company brought tea from China, while the Dutch imported coffee from Java and the Middle East. Both beverages were bitter in their natural state, but sugar transformed them into daily pleasures. In London, coffee houses sprang up where merchants, writers, and politicians gathered, always with sugar bowls at hand. Tea sweetened with sugar became a staple of English life, a ritual that persists to this day. Chocolate, introduced from the Americas, also became popular once sweetened with sugar. Without sugar, cocoa was harsh and bitter. With sugar, it became a luxury drink fit for courts and aristocrats. Together, tea, coffee, and chocolate formed a trinity of colonial beverages that reshaped European diets. And sugar was the common ingredient that made them irresistible. The wealth generated by sugar was so great that nations fought bitterly for control of its production. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the Caribbean became a battlefield where European empires clashed. Islands like Barbados, Jamaica, Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, and Martinique changed hands repeatedly in wars between England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands. To give a sense of sugar's value, during the Treaty of Paris in 1763, which ended the 7 Years' War, Britain traded control of Guadeloupe, a small sugar island, in exchange for Canada. To many contemporaries, Guadeloupe's sugar revenues seemed more valuable than the vast forests of North America. That decision reflected the extraordinary weight sugar carried in the global economy. By the 18th century, the Caribbean was the world's sugar bowl, producing vast quantities for export. Brazil also remained a major producer, and Portuguese fortunes were built on the labor of enslaved Africans in its cane fields. It is impossible to tell the story of the colonial sugar boom without confronting the scale of human suffering it produced. Millions of Africans were torn from their homes, families destroyed, lives ended in bondage. The mortality rate on plantations was appalling. In some Caribbean colonies, the enslaved population had to be completely replenished every few decades because death outpaced birth. The brutality of sugar slavery also sowed the seeds of resistance. Enslaved people rebelled, resisted, and preserved their cultures despite oppression. The most famous uprising was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, in which enslaved Africans and their descendants overthrew French colonial rule. Haiti became the first black republic in the world, and the richest sugar colony of the 18th century was transformed into a symbol of freedom. But even after Haiti's revolution, the demand for sugar did not diminish. Other colonies expanded to fill the gap, and slavery continued elsewhere for decades. Sugar's profits were simply too immense to abandon. By the late 18th century, sugar was no longer just a luxury. It had become part of daily life for millions of Europeans. Sweetened tea fueled industrial workers in England. Cakes, puddings, and preserves became staples of middle-class kitchens. Children grew up expecting sweets as a normal part of life. What had once been a rare medicine had become a mass addiction. Consumption skyrocketed, and with it came new problems. Dentists began to note widespread tooth decay. Physicians warned of digestive disorders. But sugar's popularity was unstoppable. The colonial sugar boom had succeeded in making the world dependent on sweetness. The colonial sugar boom was more than an economic transformation. It was a human catastrophe. It linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a system of exploitation that generated immense wealth for some and unimaginable suffering for others. Sugar built empires, but it also destroyed lives. By the end of the 18th century, sugar had become truly global, cultivated in the Americas, consumed in Europe, traded across oceans. It was a commodity that symbolized both progress and oppression, and it was poised to enter a new phase, the age of industrial sugar, when production would become even larger, cheaper, and more deeply embedded in modern life. By the dawn of the 18th century, sugar was no longer a rare luxury found only in apothecaries and royal courts. It had become the beating heart of entire empires. From London to Lisbon, from Amsterdam to Paris, the wealth of nations flowed with sugar. And yet, behind its crystalline whiteness lay a story of power, exploitation, and global transformation. This was the age of the Sweet Empire, when sugar was not just a commodity, but a cornerstone of colonial ambition and imperial power. No empire harnessed the power of sugar more effectively than Britain. By the late 1600s, Britain had seized control of key Caribbean islands, including Barbados, Jamaica, and later Trinidad. These colonies became the engines of Britain's sugar economy. On Barbados, one of the first islands transformed into a sugar colony. Planters rapidly replaced tobacco and cotton with cane. By the mid-17th century, the island was covered in cane fields and dotted with sugar mills powered by wind. The profits were immense. Sugar exports from Barbados alone helped finance England's navy and bankroll the expansion of London as a financial hub. In Jamaica, conquered from Spain in 1655, sugar became the backbone of the island's economy. By the 18th century, Jamaica was the largest producer of sugar in the British Empire. The wealth it generated poured into Britain, funding industries, palaces, and the expansion of trade networks that reached across the globe. The impact of sugar on Britain's growth cannot be overstated. The profits from plantations and the slave trade supported the rise of banks like Barclays and Lloyds. Insurance companies such as Lloyds of London grew wealthy insuring slave ships and cargoes of sugar. The port cities of Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow expanded into major commercial centers, their docks crowded with ships carrying sugar, rum, and enslaved Africans. Sugar made Britain rich, and in doing so, it helped build the foundations of the Industrial Revolution. Not to be outdone, France built its own sugar empire. Its most prized possession was Saint-Domingue, the western part of the island of Hispaniola. By the mid-18th century, Saint-Domingue was the richest colony in the world, producing nearly half of all sugar consumed in Europe. French planters, supported by an elaborate system of trade and slavery, created vast plantations worked by hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. The conditions were brutal and mortality rates were catastrophic, but the profits were staggering. French society grew dependent on the wealth of Saint-Domingue. and Parisian salons sweetened their coffee with sugar that came at the cost of human misery. Other French Caribbean colonies, such as Martinique and Guadeloupe, also contributed heavily to the empire's sugar wealth. Wars with Britain often centered on these islands, with treaties trading territory back and forth depending on which side could capture or defend them. The French understood well. To lose a sugar island was to lose a fortune. Meanwhile, Portugal dominated sugar production in Brazil, its most important colony. From the 16th century onward, Brazilian plantations along the northeast coast became some of the largest sugar producers in the world. The Portuguese crown relied heavily on these revenues, using them to finance imperial projects both in Europe and overseas. Brazilian sugar, produced with enslaved African labor, flowed into Europe through Lisbon, enriching merchants and fueling Portugal's maritime power. Although Brazil's dominance would later be challenged by the Caribbean, its role in the early modern sugar boom was foundational. The Dutch Republic, though lacking large sugar colonies of its own, became a crucial player in refining and trade. Amsterdam emerged as one of the great sugar refining centers of Europe. Raw sugar imported from the Caribbean and Brazil was processed in Dutch refineries, then re-exported to markets across the continent. The Dutch also acted as middlemen, transporting sugar, financing plantations, and ensuring voyages. Their expertise in commerce and shipping allowed them to profit enormously from the sugar trade, without needing vast colonies themselves. In many ways, Amsterdam's wealth was crystallized sugar, melted and reformed in its refineries before spreading out again across Europe. By the 18th century, sugar was no longer just for kings and nobles. It had trickled down to the middle classes, and even workers began to consume it regularly. The British working class, for example, adopted tea sweetened with sugar as a daily ritual. It provided quick energy for long hours in factories and fields. Per capita sugar consumption in Britain skyrocketed, rising from a few pounds per person per year in the 17th century to dozens of pounds by the 19th century. What had been a luxury was now becoming a staple, an everyday necessity. This democratization of sugar consumption only fueled the demand for more plantations, more slaves, and more expansion. The cycle was vicious. The more people consumed sugar, the more empires invested in producing it, and the more lives were destroyed in the process. Sugar also transformed European culture in profound ways. It reshaped diets, making desserts, pastries, and sweets more central to meals. It fueled social rituals, from tea time in England to coffee in France. It inspired new industries, confectionery shops, bakeries, and distilleries. Sugar even influenced art and architecture. At extravagant feasts, sugar sculptures called subtleties were crafted into fantastical shapes. Castles, animals, mythological figures. These were displayed as symbols of wealth and power, then sometimes eaten by guests. In royal courts, sugar was both decoration and delight, embodying the opulence of empire. Language, too, absorbed sugar's influence. To call something sweet became a universal metaphor for goodness, kindness, or desire. Love poems compared kisses to sugar. Advertisers in the 18th century marketed candies and chocolates with images of romance and indulgence. The very vocabulary of affection was steeped in sugar. The enormous wealth generated by sugar ensured that it remained a central cause of conflict. The Caribbean islands were repeatedly contested in wars between Britain and France. Fortunes turned on the possession of a single island, where a few square miles of land could generate more wealth than vast territories elsewhere. For example, during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, Britain captured Guadeloupe and Martinique from France. Yet at the peace negotiations, France preferred to keep its sugar islands rather than Canada. This decision reflected the immense value placed on sugar. Tropical plantations were considered more important than entire continents of forest and fur. Sugar was not only shaping economies, it was shaping geopolitics. Behind the glittering wealth of the sweet empire was relentless suffering. Enslaved Africans bore the unbearable weight of Europe's addiction. Families were torn apart, cultures disrupted, lives cut short. The average life expectancy of an enslaved worker on a Caribbean plantation was often less than a decade after arrival. Plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and replace them with new captives than to sustain them for long lives. This logic of cruelty drove the transatlantic slave trade to horrifying levels. By the late 18th century, millions of Africans had been transported across the ocean, many of them to labor in sugar fields. The sweetness enjoyed in London teacups or Parisian coffeehouses was purchased with untold human agony. By the late 18th century, however, cracks began to appear in the sweet empire. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791, struck at the very heart of France's sugar wealth. Enslaved people, inspired by ideals of liberty and justice, rose up against their oppressors and destroyed the plantation system. Haiti's independence in 1804 marked the first major blow to Europe's sugar dominance. Meanwhile, abolitionist movements in Britain and elsewhere began to question the morality of slavery. Campaigners like William Wilberforce highlighted the human cost of sugar. Boycotts of slave-grown sugar gained popularity in the early 19th century, showing that consumers were beginning to recognize the bitter truth behind their sweetness. The age of the sweet empire demonstrated sugar's unparalleled power. It was not just an agricultural product, but a force that built cities, financed wars, and fueled industrialization. It created unimaginable wealth for Europe's empires, while destroying lives across Africa and the Americas. By the end of the 18th century, sugar had become deeply embedded in daily life across Europe. Its empire seemed unshakable. Yet the very scale of its exploitation had planted the seeds of resistance. Revolutions, abolitionist movements, and changing economies would soon challenge the empire of sweetness. The story of sugar was far from over. Ahead lay the industrial age, when sugar would become cheaper, more abundant, and more central to modern diets than ever before. And when its health consequences would emerge with devastating clarity. By the dawn of the 19th century, the world had already been transformed by sugar. Empires had risen on its profits, millions of lives had been destroyed in its production, and its sweet crystals had become woven into the daily rituals of Europe. But the story of sugar was far from complete. In fact, it was about to enter a new and even more influential phase. This was the age of industrial sugar, when mechanization, science, and mass production would take sugar from a colonial luxury to an everyday staple of modern life. The 1800s were marked by the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines, mechanized mills, new forms of agriculture, and expanding global trade reshaped how societies produced and consumed goods. Sugar, already central to global commerce, was poised to benefit enormously from these changes. At the heart of this transformation was the steam engine. While earlier sugar mills had relied on animal power, water wheels, or windmills, steam engines allowed for larger, faster, and more efficient processing. Cane could be crushed more thoroughly, juice boiled more rapidly, and crystals produced in greater quantities. Entire plantations and refineries reorganized themselves around this new technology. In ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes, vast sugar refineries processed raw sugar arriving from the colonies. Steam-powered machinery enabled them to refine more sugar than ever before, reducing costs and expanding output. The result was simple but profound. Sugar became cheaper. Another revolution in sugar production came not from machines, but from plants. In the early 19th century, scientists discovered that sugar could be extracted not only from cane, but also from sugar beets. While beets contained less sugar than cane, they could be grown in temperate climates, including much of Europe. The development of beet sugar had enormous consequences. It freed Europe, at least partially, from dependence on colonial cane. In times of war, when shipping routes were disrupted, beet sugar provided an alternative supply. One of the key moments came during the Napoleonic Wars. When Britain blockaded French ports, cutting off access to Caribbean sugar, Napoleon ordered the cultivation of sugar beets across France. By 1812, French scientists had refined the process enough to make beet sugar a viable substitute. Although cane sugar would remain dominant, beet sugar steadily grew in importance throughout the 19th century, especially in Germany, France, and Russia. By the late 1800s, beet sugar accounted for a significant share of Europe's supply. Cane and beet sugar competed in markets, creating abundance that drove prices down even further. For the first time in history, sugar was within reach of ordinary workers and even the poor. The democratization of sugar consumption was one of the most striking features of the 19th century. What had once been a rare treat for kings was now available in every grocer's shop. Prices fell dramatically. In Britain, per capita consumption rose from around £4 per person per year in the early 18th century to over £90 by the early 20th century. Sugar was no longer just a luxury, it was a daily necessity. It sweetened tea, coffee, and cocoa for factory workers. It fueled children before school and laborers before long shifts. It became part of the rhythm of modern life, offering quick calories and a burst of energy in an age of industrial work. Cheap sugar also transformed diets. Preserves, jams, and marmalades became common in working-class households. Cakes, biscuits, and puddings, once the reserve of the wealthy, were now baked in homes across Europe and America. Street vendors sold candied nuts and boiled sweets. Sugar had moved from the banquet table of the aristocracy to the kitchen of the ordinary family. Industrialization gave birth to entirely new industries, none more visible than the candy industry. Entrepreneurs in the 19th century seized on the abundance of cheap sugar to create a dazzling array of sweets. In England, companies like Fry's and Cadbury began producing chocolate bars sweetened with sugar. In America, Milton Hershey established his chocolate empire in Pennsylvania, making affordable candy for millions. The invention of machines to spin sugar led to the creation of cotton candy. Hard candies, caramels, marshmallows, and later chewing gum all entered the popular diet, carried by sugar's mass availability. Candy shops became fixtures in cities, their windows filled with colorful displays designed to tempt passers-by. For children especially, sugar became a symbol of joy, celebration, and reward. Birthdays, holidays, and festivals became inseparable from sweets. This cultural shift cemented sugar's role not only as food, but as an emotional experience. Sweetness was no longer just taste. It was nostalgia, comfort, and happiness wrapped in paper. Even as beet sugar grew in Europe, colonial cane remained dominant in global markets. Plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and later in places like Mauritius, Fiji, and the Philippines continued to produce massive quantities of sugar. The abolition of the slave trade in the early 19th century and the eventual abolition of slavery in most colonies did not end exploitation. Instead, planters turned to indentured laborers, often from India or China, who were bound by contracts to work in harsh conditions for years. The sugar empire adapted, continuing to squeeze cheap labor from vulnerable populations. Meanwhile, the profits of sugar continued to finance imperial expansion. British, French, and Dutch colonies thrived on sugar revenues. American planters in Louisiana and later in Hawaii built their own fortunes on cane. Sugar was no longer just a commodity. It was a tool of imperial strategy, securing trade routes, ports, and political influence around the world. The 19th century was also the age of science, and sugar became a subject of research. Chemists studied its properties, isolating sucrose and understanding its role in the human body. Nutritionists praised sugar as a quick source of energy. For soldiers, workers, and athletes, sugar was recommended as fuel. At the same time, physicians began to notice the darker side. Dentists warned of tooth decay, which became increasingly common in societies with high sugar consumption. By the late 19th century, doctors were observing rising cases of diabetes, though the link to sugar was not fully understood. The idea of sugar as a sweet poison was already beginning to take shape, even as its popularity continued to soar. One of the most profound impacts of industrial sugar was its role in sustaining the working class. In Britain, the Industrial Revolution brought long hours in factories, poor diets, and grueling conditions. tea sweetened with sugar provided a cheap, stimulating drink that helped workers endure. It offered both hydration and calories, combining with bread to create what some historians call the first modern working-class meal. In this sense, sugar was both liberating and exploitative. It gave energy to millions of workers, but it also created dependence. Employers encouraged sugar consumption because it made laborers more productive. Children were fed sugary foods to keep them quiet and satisfied. Sugar was becoming not only a commodity of pleasure, but also a tool of control in industrial society. The 19th century also saw sugar spread further across the globe. Plantations expanded in India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. In places like Fiji and Mauritius, entire societies were reshaped around sugar production. Waves of indentured laborers from India were transported to work these fields, creating diasporas that still exist today. In the United States, sugar became central to Louisiana's economy and later to Hawaii, where American planters wielded enough power to influence politics and eventually annex the islands. Sugar was no longer just European. It was truly global, shaping economies and societies on every continent. The industrial age transformed sugar from a luxury into a necessity. Machines, beet cultivation, and global plantations combined to flood markets with cheap sweetness. For the first time in history, ordinary people consumed sugar daily, in quantities unimaginable to their ancestors. But this democratization came with costs. Health problems began to surface. Labor exploitation continued in new forms, and societies grew dependent on a commodity that was both pleasure and poison. By the end of the 19th century, sugar was firmly established as one of the defining ingredients of modern life. It fueled workers, sweetened rituals, inspired industries, and shaped global empires. The story of sugar was no longer about scarcity. It was about abundance, addiction, and the consequences of industrial progress. Ahead lay the 20th century, when sugar's legacy would become even more complex. Celebrated as a symbol of joy, condemned as a cause of disease, and debated as a substance that both unites and divides modern society. By the late 19th century, sugar had conquered the world. It sweetened tea in London, flavored coffee in Paris, filled candy shops in New York, and flowed from refineries in Hamburg and Amsterdam. Once rare and precious, sugar had become so abundant that it was considered almost essential to daily life. But behind this triumph lay shadows that could not be ignored. For every spoonful of sweetness, there was a bitter price. The price was paid in human suffering, in broken bodies, in distorted economies, and in health consequences that began to echo through generations. This part of our story looks not at sugar's glory, but at the costs that were too often hidden behind its glittering crystals. The most immediate and obvious cost of sugar's rise was human exploitation. From the first colonial plantations to the vast industrial estates of the 19th century, sugar was built on coerced labor. Even after the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century, The system of exploitation did not disappear. In the Caribbean, in Brazil, in Louisiana, and across the Pacific, plantation owners turned to indentured labor. Contracts brought workers from India, China, and elsewhere to toil in cane fields under harsh conditions. On paper, indentured labor looked different from slavery. Workers were promised wages and eventual freedom. In reality, the system was often little better than bondage. Contracts were manipulated, wages withheld, punishments brutal. Laborers lived in barracks, faced long hours, and endured oppressive oversight. For many, sugar meant generations, trapped in cycles of exploitation. The story was global. In Mauritius, Indians were brought by the tens of thousands to cut cane. In Fiji, indentured workers transformed the islands into sugar colonies. In Hawaii, Asian laborers fueled American sugar wealth. The faces had changed, but the suffering remained. Sugar also distorted the economies of the colonies that produced it. Entire islands and regions became dependent on a single crop. In the Caribbean, this phenomenon was known as the monocrop economy. Land that might have grown food was devoted entirely to sugarcane. This created deep vulnerabilities. When global prices fell, whole colonies suffered. Famines erupted when food had to be imported but could not be afforded. Local economies stagnated because wealth flowed outward, enriching European merchants and plantation owners rather than the communities that labored in the fields. The Caribbean islands, Brazil, and other sugar regions became locked in patterns of dependency that lasted long after slavery and colonial rule formally ended. The sweet empire had left behind bitter legacies of poverty and inequality. Another hidden cost of sugar was environmental. Plantations consumed vast amounts of land and water. Forests were cut down to make way for cane fields. Hillsides were stripped of trees to provide fuel for boiling houses. Soil was exhausted by continuous monoculture, leaving lands degraded and less fertile. Water systems were diverted to irrigate cane, disrupting ecosystems. The pollution from mills and refineries poisoned rivers and coastal areas. Sugars spread across the globe left behind a trail of environmental scars that in some places remain visible even today. Perhaps the most enduring price of sugar, however, was paid not in distant colonies, but in the bodies of consumers. When sugar was rare, its effects on health were limited. But as it became cheap and ubiquitous in the 19th century, physicians began to notice troubling patterns. Dentists reported widespread tooth decay among populations that had never experienced it before. Cavities, once a mark of privilege, now afflicted the poor as much as the rich. Doctors also began to observe diseases like diabetes with increasing frequency. Though the link to sugar was not fully understood at the time, suspicions grew. Sugar provided quick calories but no nutrients. It contributed to obesity, disrupted metabolism, and laid the groundwork for chronic illnesses. In industrial societies, sugar became a paradox. It gave energy to workers, but it also undermined their long-term health. Children were raised on sweets, developing cravings that would last a lifetime. Adults became accustomed to daily doses of sugar in tea, coffee, bread, and desserts. A slow epidemic was beginning, one that would fully reveal itself in the 20th and 21st centuries. Beyond the physical effects, sugar exerted a psychological pull. Its taste triggered pleasure centers in the brain, releasing dopamine and creating cravings. Even before scientists understood the biology, people spoke of sugar as addictive. The candy shops of the 19th century were not just businesses, they were laboratories of desire. Brightly colored sweets displayed in glass jars, sold for pennies, trained generations to associate sugar with happiness, reward, and comfort. Holidays and rituals became tied to sugary treats. Christmas puddings, Easter eggs, birthday cakes. This cultural conditioning meant that sugar was not just food, but an emotional anchor. People turned to it in times of stress, celebration, or sorrow. The psychological price of sugar was a society increasingly dependent on a substance that seemed harmless but carried invisible costs. As the 19th century progressed, voices of dissent grew louder. Abolitionists had already exposed the human cost of slavery, and some began to target sugar specifically. Campaigns urged consumers to boycott slave-grown sugar. Pamphlets depicted the suffering of enslaved workers and called on moral conscience. One famous image circulated in Britain showed a kneeling African figure with the caption, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Consumers were asked to consider every spoonful of sugar they added to their tea carried with it the pain of another human being. Although such campaigns achieved partial success, they faced powerful opposition. Planters, merchants, and governments all had vested interests in protecting the sugar trade. The sweet profits were simply too great. Still, the seeds of change were planted. By the mid-19th century, slavery was formally abolished in most European colonies. But the exploitation did not end. It merely shifted into new forms. The bitter price of sugar remained, even as its production systems adapted to new laws. In literature and art, sugar began to appear not only as a symbol of sweetness, but also of corruption. Writers drew parallels between sugar's seductive taste and its destructive consequences. Poets compared it to false promises, delightful at first, bitter in the end. The duality of sugar, both sweet and poisonous, fascinated thinkers. Some philosophers saw it as a metaphor for empire itself, a glittering surface hiding darker realities of violence and exploitation. In this sense, sugar became not only a food, but also a moral question. By the turn of the 20th century, sugar had achieved something astonishing. It had hooked the world. Every class, every nation, every culture consumed it daily. From British factory workers to American school children, from Russian peasants to Indian laborers, sugar was everywhere. Yet this triumph was built on fragile foundations. Health problems were spreading. Economies were distorted. Environments were degraded. Millions of lives had been scarred by its production. The bitter price was immense, but the addiction was too strong to break. The story of sugar in the 19th century is not one of triumph. but of reckoning. It forces us to look beyond sweetness and to see the suffering, inequality, and disease that accompanied its rise. Sugar's price was not measured only in coins, but in bodies, in ecosystems, and in moral compromises. As the world entered the 20th century, sugar's influence would only grow. New industries, new technologies, and new forms of marketing would ensure that the addiction continued. And yet, so too would the costs. Sugar was not just the sweet poison of the colonial age. It was becoming the sweet poison of modern life. By the 20th century, sugar had completed its transformation from a rare luxury to an everyday necessity. It was no longer confined to palaces or apothecaries. Instead, it had become a fixture of kitchens, factories, and global trade networks. But sugar's modern legacy is not simple. It is a story of abundance and pleasure, of industry and globalization, of health crises and debates that still rage today. Sugar is everywhere, yet its presence is both comforting and troubling. To understand the modern world, we must understand how sugar continues to shape our diets, our economies, and our imaginations. The early 20th century marked the height of sugar's global spread. Plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, India, the Philippines, and the Pacific continued to produce massive quantities of cane. In Europe and North America, beet sugar refineries churned out millions of tons each year. World wars disrupted supply, but also reinforced sugar's role as a strategic commodity. Governments rationed sugar, recognizing its importance not only for civilians, but for armies. Soldiers carried sugar-rich rations for quick energy. Candy bars became standard in military supplies. Sugar was considered almost essential to morale. After the wars, sugar consumption surged again. The mid-20th century saw the rise of mass consumer industries, soda companies, candy manufacturers, breakfast cereals, and processed foods, all built on sugar. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Kellogg's, Nestlé, Hershey's. These names became global empires in their own right, fueled by sweetness. One of the most distinctive features of sugar's modern legacy is the role of advertising. Companies discovered that sugar could be marketed not just as food, but as happiness. In the 1950s and 1960s, jingles promised that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. Brightly colored packaging targeted children, linking sweets to joy, energy, and fun. Cartoon mascots danced across cereal boxes. Slogans like "Have a Coke and a Smile" tied sugar directly to emotional well-being. This marketing was extraordinarily effective. Children grew up associating sugar with pleasure and reward, while adults came to see it as a necessary comfort. Entire generations were conditioned to consume sugar daily, often without realizing how much they were eating. By the late 20th century, sugar was no longer just in obvious treats. It was in bread, ketchup, salad dressings, canned vegetables, and even savory snacks. Food companies added sugar not only for taste, but also for texture, preservation, and addictiveness. Nutritionists began warning that people were consuming far more sugar than they realized. A glass of soda contained 10 teaspoons of sugar. A breakfast cereal marketed as healthy could contain more sugar than a dessert. The modern diet became saturated with hidden sweetness, making it nearly impossible to avoid. This abundance had consequences. Rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease began to climb. Scientists pointed to sugar as a key culprit. Some labeled it toxic, others called it addictive. The sweet poison had never been so pervasive. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, sugar had become one of the most controversial ingredients in the world. Public health campaigns warned of its dangers. Governments debated soda taxes, warning labels, and restrictions on advertising to children. Doctors linked sugar not only to obesity and diabetes, but also to metabolic syndrome, fatty liver disease, and dental crises. Yet the sugar industry fought back. For decades, lobbying groups funded research to downplay the risks. In the 1960s, industry-funded studies shifted blame for heart disease from sugar to fat, shaping dietary guidelines for years. Only later did independent researchers uncover how much influence the sugar industry had exerted. The result was confusion. Consumers were told first to fear fat, then to fear carbs, then to fear sugar specifically. The debate continues today, with some experts calling sugar the most harmful ingredient in the modern diet, while others argue moderation is possible. What is clear is that sugar remains at the center of public health discussions, a symbol of the tension between pleasure and danger. Despite the health debates, sugar's cultural power endures. Birthdays without cake are unthinkable. Holidays are marked with sweets, chocolate eggs at Easter, candy canes at Christmas, mooncakes and mithai in Asia. Sugar is woven into rituals of joy, celebration, and togetherness across cultures. In literature, music, and film, sugar continues to symbolize love, temptation, and indulgence. From the phrase "sugar and spice and everything nice" to pop songs about sugar, sugar, the metaphor remains strong. Sweetness is still shorthand for affection and desire. At the same time, sugar carries darker cultural meanings. Documentaries and exposés portray it as a hidden killer. Books warn of sugar addiction. Parents worry about its effects on children. The duality persists. Sugar is both comfort and threat, celebration and controversy. In the modern world, sugar is a trillion-dollar industry. Brazil remains the largest producer of cane, while India, China, Thailand, and Mexico also play major roles. The European Union produces vast amounts of beet sugar. Global trade in sugar is immense, with futures markets and multinational corporations controlling its flow. Sugar has also become linked to energy production. In Brazil, cane is used not only for sugar, but also for ethanol, a biofuel. This dual use has tied sugar production to debates about climate change and renewable energy. Labor exploitation has not vanished. Reports of poor conditions on plantations continue, especially where small farmers struggle against powerful corporations. The bitter price of sugar, though less visible than in the age of slavery, remains present in inequities of global trade and environmental damage. In the 21st century, sugar is everywhere, but it is also under siege. Public awareness of its dangers has never been higher. Campaigns encourage reduced consumption, sugar-free products flood supermarkets, and governments debate new regulations. And yet, sugar remains irresistible. Global consumption continues to rise, particularly in developing countries where processed foods are expanding rapidly. For billions, sugar is both a symbol of modern prosperity and a hidden burden on health systems. The modern legacy of sugar is complex. It is joy and disease, ritual and controversy, empire and exploitation, comfort and crisis. Few substances have so completely captured human desire or shaped human history. When we stir sugar into coffee, we are tasting not only sweetness, but also centuries of conquest, labor, and invention. When we bite into a piece of cake, we inherit traditions of celebration that span cultures and continents. And when we read headlines about obesity and diabetes, we confront the costs of an addiction that began long ago. Sugar is no longer rare, but it is still powerful. It binds the world together in ways both sweet and bitter. Its story is not finished, because every generation must decide anew how much of the sweet poison to embrace and how much of its price to bear. Sugar. It began as a reed swaying in the fields of India, crushed by hand to release a few drops of sweet juice. It became crystals that dazzled ancient healers, a medicine treasured by Persians and Arabs. It passed through the hands of crusaders, merchants, and kings, transforming feasts in medieval Europe. And then, in the great age of empire, sugar ignited wars, enslaved millions, and built fortunes so vast they reshaped the world. The story of sugar is one of paradox. It is joy and sorrow, comfort and cruelty, luxury and necessity. It sweetened love poems and children's birthdays, yet it fueled slavery, revolution, and suffering. It gave energy to factory workers and soldiers, yet it sowed epidemics of disease that still challenge us today. Few substances capture the contradictions of human history as powerfully as sugar. Its crystals are innocent, white, and pure. But each grain carries echoes of fields worked in misery, ships crowded with captives, cities enriched at others' expense, and industries built on endless consumption. And yet, sugar also represents resilience and culture. Across the world, people turned it into rituals of celebration. They used it to honor gods, to welcome guests, to comfort children. They shaped it into art, into memories, into symbols of sweetness that endure even when its darker side is remembered. Today, sugar is everywhere. It is in our kitchens, our restaurants, our holidays, our advertising, our debates about health and morality. We cannot escape it, but we can understand it. To trace the history of sugar is to trace the history of ourselves, our desires, our empires, our progress, and our mistakes. As we close this story, one truth lingers. Sugar was never just food. It was power crystallized, empire refined, addiction packaged, and memory preserved. It is a substance that connects past and present, sweetness and bitterness, pleasure and price. This has been the Culinary Past. Thank you for joining us in exploring the story of sugar, the sweet poison that changed the world. Until next time, may history remind us that even the sweetest things can carry the heaviest shadows.